Quote, this is from the editorial. Every Negro lynched is called a big, burly, black brute, when in fact, many of those who have thus been dealt with had white men for their fathers, and were not only black and burly, but were sufficiently attractive for white girls of culture and refinement to fall in love with them, as is very well known to all. Let virtue be something more than an excuse for them to intimidate and torture a helpless people. Tell your men that it is no worse for a black man to be intimate with a white woman than for a white man to be intimate with a colored woman. You set yourselves down as a lot of carping hypocrites in that you cry aloud for the virtue of your women while you seek to destroy the morality of ours. Now, as you can imagine, this did not go over very well with the white supremacist leadership, and in fact, the article was reprinted not only in North Carolina, but across the South, and there was a bidding war for a while because everybody wanted to get their hands on it. So actually, Manley made a little bit of money because he kept reprinting it. But after it appeared, the vigilantes, the white vigilante militia of the supremacy movement were called red shirts. They wanted to lynch Manley that day. And to show you how calculated and premeditated this coup was, the leaders of the coup said, no, not now. This will have much greater political impact several months later in November. This was in August. They said, we're going to wait till the November elections, and then we can really use this. And I promise you guys, you can not only lynch Manley, but you can burn down the newspaper. And they did. They didn't lynch Manley. He escaped. He got warnings. He escaped 2 days before the election. And in fact, it was interesting, a white neighbor of his knew that he was going to be lynched, warned him, gave him $25 in gold, and gave him the password that you needed to get through the white sentinels. The whites had militarized Wilmington. And they set up checkpoints all around the city, and they organized it on a block-by-block basis. But with the password, he got through and escaped to Philadelphia, as a matter of fact. He lived 40 years in Philadelphia after that.
All right.
11 the Walnut.
One of the things that is chilling, but in a very odd way, kind of refreshing, is the complete lack of euphemism. I mean, there are no apologies for the pure racism, pure white supremacy. I know you talk about Waddell's speech. You want to give us?
Yeah, let me tell you who he was. Colonel Alfred Moore Waddell was one of the leaders in Wilmington of the coup and the massacre. He was a former Confederate colonel. He had been a congressman, a U.S. congressman. He had run a newspaper, and he was this fabulous orator. And during the summer, spring, and fall of 1898, he traveled through the Cape Fear countryside, giving these race-baiting speeches, inciting white men to attack blacks to prevent them from voting. The night before the election, he gave an absolutely chilling speech, and Mark's right, the N-word appeared in print constantly. It was in all the newspapers. It was used commonly. I was just shocked. That was one of the things that shocked me about the research of this book, that how open and nakedly racist these people were and how proudly racist they were. So again, this is the speech to about 1,000 red shirts and other vigilantes downtown Wilmington the night before the election. And again, this is Alfred Moore Waddell. What page, Mark?
161.
Thank you. I knew I would lose it.
I memorized this.
Yeah, okay. As impressive. Again, this is from his speech to a bunch of whooping red shirts. Quote, "Men, the crisis is upon us. You must do your duty. This city, county, and state shall be rid of Negro domination once and forever. You have the courage. You're brave. You are the sons of noble ancestry. You are Anglo-Saxons. You are armed and prepared, and you will do your duty. Go to the polls tomorrow, and if you find the Negro out voting, tell him to leave the polls. And if he refuses, kill him. Shoot him down in his tracks."
So one of the things, Dave, that really struck me as I read your book was that it's such an astonishing episode from American history.
Right.
And I was never taught this. I didn't know anything about this. So, and you grew up in North Carolina. Why didn't we know about this?
Basically, the white supremacists, on the one hand, they boasted about it. They were proud of it. They wrote about it in memoirs and in letters to each other and newspaper articles. But at the same time, they created the lie that's in the title. And the lie was two things. One, that blacks were planning a riot for the election. And they told everyone that. They printed it in the papers. And they said they were going to rise up and take over the town. And a lot of whites believed their own propaganda. A lot of whites sent their families out of Wilmington for the election because they were afraid of this black riot. The other myth was that they propagated in the newspapers was that blacks were not intelligent. They were certainly not intelligent enough to vote, and certainly not intelligent enough to run and hold public office and to make important decisions. They said they were venal, corrupt, and the reason they had to rise up and take over was because this corrupt administration on what they called Negro rule. And when I went to high school and college in North Carolina, not once did any teacher or professor mention this event. It wasn't in the history books. When I was a freshman at UNC in Chapel Hill, the dorm I was assigned to was Morrison dorm. And I didn't know who Morrison was. Somebody said he was a governor. I didn't care who he was. Years later, I find out he's a character in my book. He was one of the speakers on the white supremacy campaign during that summer who rode through the countryside giving these race-baiting speeches inciting whites to go out and attack blacks. And in fact, he was one of 3 speakers who became governor of North Carolina, in large parts due to the fame that they won during this white supremacy campaign. When I was at school, I went to football games at a stadium called Kenan Stadium. You may have seen it on TV. I had no idea who Kenan was, and again, I didn't care. Years later, I'm researching this book. Again, he's a character in the book. He was William Buck Rand Kenan. He was the head of one of the gun squads that rode through the town killing black men. So I bring this up only to make the point that this really is an ancient history. It's right now. The legacy is today. There are almost 30 buildings on the campus of the University of North Carolina named for white supremacists, and many of them were white supremacists involved in this campaign. So I didn't know it, but this book has been following me around for most of my adult life because I didn't know about this until about 20 years ago.
So tell us how you found out about it, and when and why did you decide to write a book about it?
I found out about it in 1998 because the University of North Carolina at Wilmington held some centennial events, and they tried very hard to bring blacks and whites together after 100 years and try to come up with some sort of reconciliation, but they also wanted to burrow down and tell the real story. They wanted to end the lie and the myth that had been going for a century. And they brought blacks and whites together, and particularly the descendants on both sides. And they held meetings, and it worked fairly well. They brought people together. They got a memorial put up in memory of the victims, and they rewrote the state historical marker, which had called it a race riot, when in fact it was a racial coup and a massacre. They changed that. But there was one issue that sort of split the town again, and that was reparations. Because it came up, and many members of the white community just adamantly refused to have any part of it, and it's still splitting the community. I gave a talk there a couple of weeks ago, and it was sponsored by the NAACP, and I was anticipating there would be some whites there who would jump up and say, why are you dredging up this ancient history? Just let it be. But no, it did not happen. But reparations was the main topic, or one of the main topics of discussion during that book talk.
So did you cover this for some reason? Or what brought this to your attention and made you personally decide to write about it?
Again, in 1998, I read newspaper stories about this centennial, and I could not believe it. Like, how did I not know about this, and how could this happen in the United States of America? So I just said, I've got to write a book about it. There had been one academic book written about it in 1984, but it didn't get a whole lot of attention. So I really just wanted to basically correct the historical record and bring this story to the country. And when I go to other parts of the country, no one has ever heard of this. Yeah. Very, very few people. So that's why I decided to do it, and I just had to wait. I mean, I have a real job writing for newspapers, and I just never had time, and I finally got the time and decided to sit down and do it. And it took about 3 years. And obviously, as you know, it's all on paper. There was nobody to interview, and I'm used to interviewing people live or witnessing events myself, and this was a different experience for me. Everything in here comes from a piece of paper, from a document, right. Which is why it took so long.
And I should say, David is an extremely good writer, and it's a very compelling and dramatic story. he writes a narrative about these events. It doesn't read like a work of academic history. It reads like the work of a Pulitzer Prize winning storytelling journalist. And, I think that, the question that you said, there were some angry whites who showed up at the NAACP event. Why are you dragging up this ancient history? Why is it important, do you think, for us to read about this history which has been basically hidden from us?
Because it's not over. I had really a sinking feeling as I was researching this book. Charlottesville happened in 2017, I believe. And it just occurred to me those very fine people who were marching around with the torches and chanting, "Jews will not replace us," would have been right at home in Wilmington in 1898. And since 2016, and you've all seen it, this white resentment, white rage, white hate and racism has been dredged up, and I think it's been sitting there all along. The election in 2016 brought it to the surface, and I think it's terrifying because I see some of these same themes running today as in 1898, the scapegoating of people of color or certain ethnic groups, the demonizing of people of color, setting them up as targets. I mean, I'll give you one example. In 1898, the editor, Alex Manley, in addition to getting many, many death threats, was constantly told to go back to Africa. And just this summer, we had 3 United States congresswomen of color told to go back to their home countries. Another example is in 1898, whites were told explicitly over and over in this newspaper campaign that blacks were coming to rape their women and take their jobs. In 2015, a certain presidential candidate came down the escalator to announce his run for president and said Mexican criminals and rapists, he used the term rapists, are flowing across the border to take your jobs. So this has all been simmering under the surface, and I don't think we've gone a whole lot of very far from 1898
we haven't
in
done
some
much
ways.
as a country to reckon with this
Right.
past. And in Germany, there are monuments to the Holocaust, and children in Germany are taken to tour the concentration camps. Germany as a country has confronted the Nazi regime and what happened. And in South Africa, which you covered,
The
where you
Truth
won
and
your Pulitzer Prize,
Reconciliation hearings? Yeah.
there are museums in South Africa to make sure that the young people in South Africa understand the apartheid period. We don't really do that in America.
No, we don't talk openly about race. They talk more openly about race back in 1898 than we do today. They were very explicit about it, and they said why we don't think black people belong, and it's a little more subtle today. And I think it's sitting there bubbling, but I don't think it's addressed. Now, I will give Wilmington credit. They did try to bring blacks and whites together, and they did put up this memorial to the victims with a big sign there that gives the true story. So I give them credit for that, but there is a lot more to be done in addressing openly what's going on. One point we were talking about earlier, today you're constantly seeing these videos of young black men, unarmed black men being shot dead by police officers, and I understand so clearly why young black men might be afraid of white men in uniform, because in 1898, in addition to having the red shirts, the white supremacists had their own 2 state militias, the Wilmington Light Infantry and the Naval Reserves. These were state militias. They were the National Guard of the day, but they were led by white supremacists and made up of white supremacists, and they served in the Spanish-American War, but the leaders of the white supremacy campaign made sure they were back in Wilmington in time for the day of the coup, which was planned ahead of time. But at the same time, also, these men were in federal service. They hadn't been mustered out, so they were United States soldiers murdering black citizens in the streets of Wilmington. At the same time, there were segregated black units from Wilmington that were called up for service in the Spanish-American War, but the leaders of the white supremacy campaign made sure that they stayed on a training base in Georgia, hundreds of miles away, on the day of the coup, so the black community was defenseless. You had all these young black men trained as soldiers, trained in weapons, and they are hundreds of miles away, and the blacks were not allowed to buy guns, while whites were stockpiling guns all summer. They refused to sell guns to blacks, so the only weapons they had were some old shotguns and pistols. Many of the blacks in Wilmington were descendants of the colored soldiers from the Civil War. The colored units had weapons, but they were completely outgunned and defenseless.
And there's still statues to the Confederate generals and heroes all over the South. I remember growing up as a kid, and I would hear on news reports or read in magazines Malcolm X's speeches, and I used to wonder, what country did he grow up in? This isn't the America that I know, and apparently he was right and I was wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you, David and Mark. Great discussion. Where was the Ku Klux Klan during all of this? Because they had been active 30 years before during Grant's administration. And then my impression is that they started on the decline in the last decade of the 19th century.
Right.
And then I have an add-on question. There were a number of other episodes like this throughout the South. I think Colfax in Louisiana, and how many others were there?
Right. I'm glad you asked the question about the Klan. There was a black man named Abraham Galloway, who was a slave born in Wilmington. He escaped, stowed away on a ship, and came to Philadelphia. Was met here by the Vigilance Committee, which was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and he went back to the South as a Union spy. He was from Wilmington. He came back to Wilmington in 1868 when there was a statewide amendment after the war. All the southern states were required to write a new constitution. And this was the first time that blacks could vote in North Carolina. And Galloway led the effort and got the Constitution passed. But that year, during the campaign, the white supremacists of the day in 1868 were trying really hard to suppress the black vote. It terrified them, and they were intimidating blacks in Wilmington. They rode ox carts with ghosts through the city, thinking they would terrify blacks. They had ghosts everywhere at the post office. And they announced that on 2 nights before the election, that they were going to really kill the black vote in the city. And Abraham Galloway came up with an informal black militia. They had fence posts and clubs. They met the Klan, beat the hell out of them, drove them out of Wilmington, and they did not appear on the streets of Wilmington until the 1920s. Unfortunately, by 2008, about 1898, the red shirts rose up, and this was this vigilante, and they were all descendants of Klan, and it was essentially the Klan.
Well, there were also, this is, 30 years after the Civil War ended, so there were still Confederate veterans.
Confederate veterans and their sons and nephews, and that's who made up the white supremacy movement in Wilmington. And what's interesting is the white commander, Colonel Roger Moore, of the Klan in 1868 was the leader of the red shirts in 1998. And he failed in 1868, but he succeeded remarkably well in 1898. The second part of your question was? Oh, yeah. There have, as you well know, there have been many so-called race riots in our history, late 19th century, early 20th century. I think Wilmington's pretty unique, and most of these, the spark was a fairly spontaneous outburst of white rage, usually involving alleged contact between a black man and a white woman. In many of these other cases, in Wilmington, it was completely unique. It was premeditated for months. It was planned. It wasn't spontaneous at all. And secondly, not only did they murder blacks, which happened many, many times in other riots, they took over an elected government. And this was, to me, by far the most lasting, permanent, and successful overthrow of an elected government in U.S. history.
I'm a UNC graduate as well. I lived in Eringhouse dorm, so I'm very familiar with Morrison and James and the other memorials to the Confederacy on that campus. I'm also from Wilmington, North Carolina. And so my it's not a question, but a comment, an expression of gratitude for writing the book, because I never knew of the history
Really?
either until I was living in New York City in my 30s.
Wow.
But I felt it growing up. It was never spoken, but there's a reason I became a civil rights lawyer.
Right.
It's because it was all around us, but there were no words or acknowledgments of the existence of it.
Thank you.
In the mid-'80s, I was the first African-American graduate of the private school called Cape Fear Academy. And the names that you have referred to were the names of many of my classmates and
Wow.
founders of the school. But people still, to my knowledge, don't really talk about it. And had you not covered in the book and said that there was a biracial leadership of the government in Wilmington, I would have never known that there was a biracial anything in Wilmington, because the segregation continues to this day.
I think today it's what, 18%?
Yeah, it was 56% in 1898. It's 18% today.
Okay, so African Americans remember Wilmington.
So thank you very much for the book.
Thank you for sharing your story.
It gives an opportunity for the conversations that
Right.
that we need to have. Thank
I
you.
wish I'd met you when I was researching my book. Thank you.
Could you mention or go over about the God-fearing, Bible-toting ministers
Yes.
that brought out and talked racism
Yes.
and brought it to the forefront and even spoke about it in the pulpits?
Absolutely. That was one of the things that shocked me the most in doing the research for this book. On the day of the coup, white ministers were on the street with Winchester guns, participating and joining with these mobs of white men going around killing people. And during the summer and fall of 1898, they gave sermons on about black Negro domination, Negro rule, and how awful it was, and how they might have to use force to overcome it. The coup and the massacre was on a Thursday, and the following Sunday, the white churches were full. Every white minister gave these stirring sermons about how they had been liberated from Negro rule. One even said, "We have taken a city." Another one compared it to the taking of Jerusalem. And they congratulated the red shirts on murdering black men and driving people out of the city. I forgot to mention that during the day of the coup, you can imagine what this must have been like for black families as their men are being slaughtered in the streets. And hundreds of them just fled to the swamps and the woods and to a black cemetery where they thought the white gunmen wouldn't go. And they were out there for 2 nights and 3 days. It was November, it had rained that day, and it was cold. At least one black child died of exposure. And when they felt safe enough to come back to the city, they stayed only long enough to gather up their belongings and flee. More than 2,100 people, black people, fled in the days and the weeks afterwards. Now, the Sunday after the coup, all the black ministers who had survived because they had gone along, they hadn't challenged white authority, they were allowed to stay, and they were shocked that they were allowed to give sermons. And I quote some of the sermons in the book, and they're all, "Don't challenge white authority, know your place, we'll be fine if we let the whites rule, they know best, just be quiet." It was absolutely shocking.
First and foremost, thank you for this book. I live in New Jersey, and I used to be a teacher, I used to be an electrician at a campus that's known as the Manual Training Industrial School for Colored Youth. Prior to this book, were you aware of the contributions of Congressman White?
Yes.
The reason I bring that up, because I came across an article that references that school, Congressman White, 1902, New York Times.
Wow.
And it's a great article. I have it here with me if someone wants the copies.
I'd love to see it.
But in addition to that, by the way, Congressman White moved to Philadelphia, died in Philadelphia, is buried in Collingsdale, Pennsylvania at Eden Cemetery. In addition to that, down in Cape May County, New Jersey, Whitesboro, New Jersey, is named after
You're absolutely
Congressman
right.
White.
Yep.
So I want to thank you for this book, because I came across Congressman White through this article and through everything that he was able to do for the blacks coming out of the South.
Right.
Which included my family.
Really?
Way back when my grandmother came up here with her 12 kids.
Wow.
Okay, from not too far from there, New Bern.
Yeah, I know
New Bern,
New Bern, yeah.
Exactly. So thank you.
Wow. Right.
And also thanks to NPR for putting this out and Philadelphia Library System. Great job.
Thank you for coming out. And you should read up on George Henry White. He was an amazingly courageous man, and there is a biography of him out there, and he was incredible.
Can you talk a little bit more to the infighting that was the Democratic Party? Because this was also about ensuring a entirely white supremacist Democratic Party for 50, 60 years of our,
of course, yeah.
Our lives that went on to support the most racist president, Woodrow Wilson, which then has lots of reasons for Daniels.
Who spent his youth in
Yeah,
Wilmington, by
yeah,
the way.
Yeah, yeah.
So you want to know, the reason, in fact, that there was a multiracial government in Wilmington was because white farmers had supported the Populist Party in North Carolina. And in the early 1890s, there was a terrible recession, and the white farmers felt that the Democrats, which everyone knows was the party of white supremacy then, and the Republicans were the party of Lincoln and black suffrage, the farmers felt that the Democrats had aligned themselves with big-moneyed interests like banks and railroads, and they felt that they weren't addressing bread-and-butter issues like jobs and their children's education. So they made a crucial decision to align themselves with Republicans, which meant that these poor white farmers were aligning themselves politically with black voters, because it was the black voters voting Republican that helped put Republicans in office. And this came to be known as fusion, and that was the only way the government in Wilmington became multiracial, was through this fusion between the white populist and the black and white Republicans. If that answers your question.
I just have a question, because thinking about what you were saying around us, no one ever being taught this stuff. I mean, I grew up and was educated in one of the Philly suburbs that is supposedly one of the best school districts in the nation, and heard nothing about this stuff.
Right.
And I'll also say that I'm now an educator, so I was wondering, my question really is, what is your advice to educators or to school districts in general about how to get more of this information out there? Obviously, this is just one of many examples,
Right.
But it's missing from the narrative. And so how do we get that? How do we
Yeah.
sort of start to change that?
That is a great question, because I found out that in the current textbooks, before I answer that, can I read you from a 1940 textbook, which is just astonishing? This is a North Carolina public school textbook that was taught to children. Then I will answer your question. This was in 1940. This was what school kids were reading, and this was in reference to why, according to this history book, the red shirts and the KKK were necessary. Quote, "To put an end to this terrible condition, white people all over the South joined together in a sort of club, which they named the Ku Klux Klan. Members of the Ku Klux Klan, dressed as ghosts, scared lawless men into acting decently. On moonlit nights, these men could be seen on horseback, riding to bring order back into the lives of their people. Such sights frightened the Negroes into living better lives. The names of those men, Negro or white, who had done wrong were listed. The next moonlit night, the Ku Klux Klan would visit these men and punish them according to the wrongs they had done. After this, lawless men were not so bold, and crime became less and less." This was taught to school kids in 1940. I mean, there are people alive who learned this in school. Now, Catherine, in answer to your question, I checked the current school textbooks in North Carolina. They barely mention this event. It's in a couple of paragraphs, and they summarize it, and they still call it a race riot, but they don't talk about the long-term ramifications and what this did to North Carolina and across the South. And in giving talks around North Carolina, I've had so many teachers come up to me, public school teachers, saying, "This is not in our curriculum, and in the book we use, because it's county by county, it's not in there, but I teach it anyway." I had so many, and that really, really gave me hope. So I hope teachers everywhere are doing that, are taking the initiative on their own to talk about these, not just Wilmington, but many other shameful episodes in our past that aren't taught, and start teaching them, even if they aren't in the curriculum.
Yeah, I would think a visit like to the African American Museum here in Philadelphia. They would, I'm sure, have curators and experts who would be knowledgeable about this period in Pennsylvania history, so that might be useful.
The society we're living in today, I see some comparisons to what was happening in 1898. Could you talk a little bit about what was going on in Washington, D.C. in 1898? William McKinley was president. If you look at that era, it was Grover Cleveland, McKinley, and then T.R. came in. So I'd just like your talks about what was happening in the nation's capital, and if there was any response at all, or any debate on the floor, any commentary. What was it like? And do you see any comparison to what happened during McKinley's time to what's happening during Trump's time?
Right. I'm so glad you asked that, because that was one of the points I meant to bring up earlier and I forgot, so thank you. Both before the coup, during the summer when the whites were announcing that they were going to do it, George Henry White went to the White House and met with William McKinley and warned him. He said, they are going to kill us, they are going to overthrow the government, they're going to take back the legislature through fraud. A group of black ministers also met in the White House with McKinley and said the same thing. After the coup and massacre, the same thing happened. George Henry White and these ministers went and talked to McKinley. He did absolutely nothing. I could find nothing in the historical record where he ever said one word in public about what happened in Wilmington. There were cabinet meetings, I found out, where it was discussed, but he did not discuss it publicly. And that was surprising to me, because McKinley was an abolitionist. He served in the Union Army. He gave a speech at the 1888 Republican Convention warning people that white so-called redeemers across the South were suppressing the black vote through the Klan and intimidation. But in the summer of 1898, the peace negotiations with Spain were going very badly. He was getting a lot of political heat for that. American soldiers in Puerto Rico and Cuba were dying of yellow fever, and he was just getting pummeled by Congress and being blamed for not equipping the troops and making them serve under poor sanitary conditions. And I think he made a political calculation that he did not want to antagonize white voters, not only in North Carolina, but across the South, because if he had stepped up and done anything about it, they would have been enraged. And I think it was also a cynical decision. He realized that since he had been elected, whites had done such an incredible job of suppressing the black vote over the 2 or 3 years period, and he was running for re-election in 1900, and I think he realized, well, the black votes helped get me into office now, but they're not going to help me now because they're not voting. So I think for all these reasons, he did nothing. And I will say today, the federal government, this was before Trump, has really stepped in, because white conservatives in Raleigh, in the state capitol, control the state legislature. One of the first things they did when they took control was to pass a voter ID bill, and I believe there was one here in Pennsylvania. Yeah, but before they did, they checked with state officials to find out how many blacks had driver's license, how many blacks voted on Souls to the Bowls, early voting on Sunday, how many voted a straight ticket. And they wrote the law that addressed all of these, and in a clear attempt to suppress the black vote. And civil rights groups went to court, and the federal courts struck down the voter ID law, and one federal judge said that it targeted African Americans with surgical precision. So the court stepped in and threw it out, and then it came back as an amendment, and it passed easily in North Carolina, and the court struck it down again, saying the primary concern of the legislature was race, and that race and voting were inextricably linked in North Carolina history going back to 1898, so it was struck down. Another example was gerrymandering. In 1898, the whites in Wilmington squeezed the black majority into 2 black wards to dilute the votes. And just a few years ago, the white conservatives in North Carolina gerrymandered 28 state districts and 2 congressional districts. They squeezed blacks into these long serpentine districts to basically dilute their votes, the same way they did in 1898. But this time, the federal government stepped in the lower courts ruled that all of these gerrymanders were racial gerrymanders in direct violation of the 14th Amendment, and they threw them out and forced them to be redrawn, and last fall, the United States Supreme Court upheld it. So this was before, before Trump, most of this. I hate to think if Trump had been in office and in head of the and Barr would have been head of the Justice Department back when these laws were challenged, I shudder to think what might have happened.
I was part of a group that went to Alabama to visit the civil rights movement, and there is a museum in Montgomery. That's a terrific museum, fascinating and extremely well done. And they are still also having trouble with the voting situation, identifying themselves and having the right to vote. But I would invite everyone to go to that museum because it's absolutely spectacular and says it all.
Yeah, I've read about it. I haven't been there. I would love to go. I'm sure a lot of people here have probably been.
I want to ask you, you do use the expression ballot and the bullet in your book, and I just wanted to know if you, if that was used back in 1898, that expression.
Yes, it was, openly, in the newspapers.
Thank you.
They, and on these stump speeches during the white supremacy campaign, that was the phrase they used: we are going to end Negro rule and Negro domination by the ballot or the bullet or both. Yes, they were very open about it. And as we said before, they didn't hold back then. They were very explicit.
You talk about how the long campaign leading up, very public, very open. What were the black citizens of Wilmington doing then? Did they hear it? Did they flee in advance? What did they say about it while they're waiting for this to come down the pike?
They were terrified, and as I was writing this book, I felt that same, even though I knew how it come out, I just had this sense of dread, and I can only imagine the sense of dread they must have happened because they're reading these white newspapers every day and talking about how inferior blacks are and how unintelligent they are and how they're rapists and how they're going to rise up and take over the government. And I think they felt helpless. They did have Alexander Manley and his black newspaper defending them and pushing back, but I think they must have just felt paralyzed and helpless, and I think they really wanted to believe that this couldn't possibly happen. Even though they're openly threatening this, our white neighbors wouldn't do this to us. I don't think they would. And even Manley, right up before the election, he wrote a column saying, "Don't be alarmed. These are our white neighbors. These people believe law and order. I know they're making crazy statements, but I really hope we can get through the election. If you just go out and vote, we'll get through it." So that's what they were doing, and they just must have felt so helpless.
Hi, this question is addressed to Mr. Bowden. In terms of accuracy and journalistic accuracy, and it's not to do with the book, you said that I believe that slavery is illegal, and I think the amendment reads, and I hope somebody, if there's lawyers in the audience, would help me with that, is that slavery is banned except for people who have been convicted of a crime, which, to my understanding, as far as it goes, is that slavery is, and was perfectly legal if you've been convicted of a crime. And this doesn't seem trivial because since the U.S. incarcerates more people than any other country in the world, you're talking about, millions of people who are, in fact, subject to slavery, if I understand the amendment correctly. Could somebody please help me with this? Thanks.
Yeah, and in answer to your question, I don't know the answer to your question. I do think that it is true that in some states, inmates, prison inmates are put to work. And as far as I know, that's still a practice. I guess, that isn't quite the same as slavery, but I get your point. I don't believe that there's ever any law that would pertain to people once they're released from prison, that they would be enslaved. But I do think that there are work programs in penitentiaries around the country. So But I do, you know, do you know anything, David, about that?
I do know back in the 1890s in North Carolina and around the South, whites used vagrancy laws and other laws to arrest black men, and as soon as they were jailed, they served their sentence by, they would hire them out to white employers to dig ditches and to work. So that is another form of slavery. And you could also say the criminal justice system in modern America in some ways, since it targets brown people so explicitly, and they are convicted of crimes where no white under the same circumstances would be convicted, and they are targeted by the police in neighborhoods, stop and frisk. You could look at that imprisonment in broad terms as a form of slavery that never really stopped. And I don't know if that was, I forget who asked the question, if that was the point you were making in the question.
Please join me in thanking Mark Bowden
Thank
and
you.
David Zucchino.